the backpacking trek I did in Iceland. So that was about, not quite 30 years ago. And I knew I wanted to go there, and I'd read about, well, what can I do there? And I hooked up with this guy who took people into the interior of Iceland. Now, this is the place where astronauts go to train, you know? And so I trained. I went with this guy I was with at the time, and we hiked I think it's called the Conestoga Trail over in Lancaster, you know, and did sections of it every weekend. And we carry, 30, 40 pounds because we knew we were going to have to carry everything. And we got there, and the first day we're starting out, and it is so windy. It's so windy. I lean over, and I said to our guide, I think we ought to wait. It's too windy. And he said, Carol, this is Iceland. I'm like, oh, shit. I'd done a lot of walking. I'd carried pounds, but I couldn't walk in something like that. And I think it was 7 days. I don't know. It seemed like an eternity. We walked through every kind of water. It was the beginning of their summer, but it was a late summer. And so it was still melting snow. So we were walking in melting snow. And then we walked through glacial runoff, So it's one thing to walk through a creek, another thing to walk through glacial runoff. And our greatest fear was that we would fall down and everything would get wet. And then what in the hell were we going to do? Because this was before cell phones. There were no cell phones. I said to this guy, what are we going to do if something happens to one of us? And he said, okay, see that? And there's this canyon there. I think it's bigger than the Grand Canyon. I don't know. And he said, I'd go down there and I'd swim across, and there's a town over there. I'm like, oh, yeah. And I think we're all going to be dead till you get back. So, and each day we would come to some hut, and these were really primitive. I mean, nobody lived there. Nobody, not only did people not live there, there were no animals. I remember on the last day, we saw a bird, and it was an Arctic bird that somebody knew about. And everybody was so excited we saw a bird, And so we didn't go for the wildlife, but anyway, there was this, now I forgot what I was saying, but, these huts that we stayed in, they were built by the shepherds. They would bring their sheep in after the snow had melted. They weren't there yet. And they were 2 levels, so the sheep would sleep below, and then there was just a floor over them, and that you get the warmth from the sheep. Well, we didn't even have sheep, right? And so anyway, at night, it was, I forgot to tell you, this is the time of the Midsummer's Eve, okay? So if you've heard about when you're close to the poles, it gets like daylight forever. And so some days we walk for 10 hours. I'm like, oh, when are we going to get there? And our guide was fabulous, and he'd make a meal. He'd make some meal. You'd wonder where, and of course we were all starving. And then we would climb get our one dry outfit on and get into our sleeping bags, and we'd tell stories. And this is a story that my friend David, who was a librarian, told one of those sunlit nights in Iceland. Gunnar was a fisherman like his dad before him and his grandpa before him, and he lived along the craggy coast of Iceland. He lived there alone, and during the Midsummer's Eve, when days were long, he'd be out for hours fishing. And one midnight, summer's night, he came in with his fish, and he heard a sound there on the shore that he'd never heard before. And I may not be able to tell you about all that happened because that was the 5-minute signal. I just keep going? Oh, okay. All right, I'll keep going. So, all right, yes, for it. So he hears this sound, and it sounds like somebody's making, like singing. But he was too tired. You know, he had to carry all his fish up and his lines and everything. But the next morning he went down, and he found why it was the opening of a cave. And he looked down in there. He'd never seen that before. And he went down. He saw the embers of a fire from the night before. And he thought, what could this be? So the next day when he was fishing, he wasn't going to wait. When he came in, he heard that sound again, and he knew right where to go. And he went down in there, and there he saw seal skins. He saw empty seal skins laying there on the rocks. And he went over, and he grabbed one, and he took it back to his hut, and he put it in a box, and he locked it up. Well, he started thinking about these tales that he had heard. He had heard these tales that during the time of Moses, when Moses called the Red Sea to come over the people, over Pharaoh and his soldiers, that there were some good people. They were good people that were doing what they had to do with this terrible leader. And they called out to God to mercy, and God heard them and saved them and said, every year during the Midsummer's Eve, you can turn back into what you had been before. And he thought, oh, that couldn't be true. But then later on, he went down to the cave. And there he heard this voice, this beautiful voice, a weeping voice. And he went in, and sitting there on the rocks, it was the most beautiful creature he had ever seen. She was sitting there with long hair and weeping. And he instantly fell in love with her and knew he had to have her. They took my seal skin. Somebody took my seal skin. He said, don't you worry. I'll take care of you. And he took her and wrapped his coat around her and took her back to his hut. And he did. He took care of her. He called her Hilda. And eventually they got married, and he took good care of her, and they had a good life together. They had 7 children. But sometimes she'd be gone for days, and he could hear that singing down by the water. Now, she saw that trunk in the hut, and she said, what's in that trunk? And he said, oh, don't you worry about that, Hilda. Don't you worry. That's an inheritance of mine. But she saw how he kept the key to the trunk right near his heart. And one Christmas Eve, he took the children out with him, and they went to church. He didn't like to be around people. And when they were gone, he saw there on the wall, he saw that shirt, he saw that key, went over. She took that key. It was her sealskin. All this time it had been lying there. It was her sealskin. And she couldn't stop herself. She took it and she wrapped it around herself, and she became that which she had been before. And Gunnar and the children and the people in the church, they could hear songs. They could hear us singing down there at the water. Woe is me, woe is me. I have 7 children on the land and 7 in the sea. Woe is me. But Gunnar, he never saw his wife Hilda again, but sometimes he'd be out in the water, and a seal would come real close, and she'd look at him with her wet eyes, and she'd lead him on to the best fishing in the water. And sometimes the children would be playing there along the sand, and a seal would come by and toss precious shells to them. But they never saw their mother again. And that's a story I heard one of them sunlit nights there in Iceland. Woe is me.